In 1428, an alliance was formed between three powers in Central America, forming what we now call the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs ruled the area through military domination, strategic alliances, taxes, and had a culture centered around sacrifice and rituals to the many gods that were worshipped in massive temples constructed across the land. The many cities conquered by the Aztecs varied in language and traditions, and were even allowed to continue practicing their own religion, as long as they also agreed to worship Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec god of the sun and war. Cities under Aztec rule paid a tribute or tax to the Emperor Moctezuma II, and in return, they were promised protection and trade. At its peak, the empire covered much of what is today southern Mexico and had a population as high as several million people. But this Mesoamerican superpower would only thrive for just under a century before everything changed in 1519, when Spanish conquistadors arrived on their shores, their hearts set on the riches of the Americas. The ensuing clash of cultures would be rife with suspicion, betrayal, and blood, and the war would bring about the fall of the mighty Aztec Empire. In 1518, Spain was enjoying its new colony in the New World, Cuba. The island had recently been conquered and was being used as a launching point for further expeditions into the Americas to contact natives, map the landscape, and, of course, look for shiny, shiny gold. The newly appointed governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, was interested in establishing contact with the inhabitants of Mexico and called Hernán Cortés, an experienced conquistador, to lead an expedition to meet the Aztecs. Governor Velázquez told Cortés that the goal of this expedition was to be strictly focused on exploration and trade, and that conquering and settling the lands would have to wait until the Spanish royalty approved of it. But Cortés sensed ulterior motives. Mainly, he was aware that whoever was able to conquer Mexico would receive eternal fame and glory back in Spain, and Governor Velázquez wanted that for himself, as Cuba hadn't quite been as lucrative as everyone had expected. As Cortés began gathering ships and crews for his expedition, Governor Velázquez received word that he seemed to be gearing up not to explore and trade like he was told to, but was instead gathering weapons and men ready for conquering. To stop this, Velázquez sent another man, Luis de Medina, to replace Cortés as head of the expedition, but this replacement was intercepted and murdered. Desperate to stop him, Velázquez then sent orders for the entire fleet to be seized and for Cortés to be imprisoned, but Cortés managed to set sail before being captured, officially leaving Cuba as a criminal and bringing with him 11 ships and over 600 men. The first stop on the way to Mexico was Cozumel, an island just east of the Yucatan Peninsula. This part of Central America was controlled by the Maya. While attempting to convert the Mayan locals to Christianity, an odd rumor reached Cortés, telling of two other white men nearby. These men were Gerónimo de Aguilar and Gonzalo Guerrero, and they had been stranded in the Yucatan for 8 years since their shipwreck in 1511. Both had been taken captive and enslaved by the Maya, but had since earned their freedom. Guerrero chose to remain with the Maya as he now had a wife and children, and Aguilar opted to join Cortés on his journey. Aguilar would prove to be a useful asset for Cortés as an interpreter, as he had mastered the Maya language during his years there. After picking up the Aguilar, Cortés left Cozumel Island, sailed around the remainder of the Yucatan Peninsula, landing at the city of Potonchán, part of the Mayan kingdom of Tabasco. Communicating through Aguilar as translator, Cortés told the inhabitants of the city that he would do no harm and had come in peace. But contrary to his words, he ordered the musketeers and archers to ready their weapons, which did not go unnoticed by the natives. Tensions between the two groups skyrocketed, and Cortés issued a royal order to allow his men to disembark from their ships. The Maya surrounded the fleet with small canoes and told Cortés that if he set foot on the island, he would be killed, and they began firing arrows as the Spanish jumped out of their ships, sparking full combat from both sides. Bernal Díaz, a conquistador with Cortés, wrote, "Many Indians charged us with spears and others pierced us with arrows, ensuring that we did not touch land as soon as we would have liked, and with so much mud we couldn't even move, and Cortés was fighting, and he lost a shoe in the mud and came to land with one bare foot." After leaving their ships, the Spanish were at a disadvantage trying to get to shore, but ultimately their weapons, armor, and numbers were superior against the Mayan forces on the beach. The Mayan warriors fled, and the Spanish chased after them all the way to the center of their city. Upon seizing the main square of Potonchán, Cortés declared its new name to be Santa Maria de la Victoria, the first settlement of New Spain. But the fighting wasn't over. The next day, Cortés sent 2 scout groups to march a few miles inland, which quickly ran into a Mayan ambush. After several hours of fighting, the natives retreated, and the scout groups returned to Cortés. This was when a captured Mayan warrior informed the Spanish that the natives were planning to gather their forces for another attack, so Cortés ordered that the horses and the cannons be unloaded from the ships and readied for battle. As the next day dawned, the Mayan forces of the Tabasco kingdom regrouped where they fought the scout groups the previous day at a city called Centla, and Cortés marched with his men to meet them. When the two armies came face to face, the Spanish noted that there were so many natives that the entire landscape was covered with them, carrying spears, bows, and small shields. The fighting began immediately. The skirmish, later named the Battle of Centla, resulted in around 70 Spanish being injured and thousands of Mayan warriors being killed. Despite being outnumbered once again, Cortés was able to lead his men to victory, primarily thanks to his firearms, cannons, and cavalry. The Battle of Centla was the first wartime usage of cavalry in the New World, and the Maya had never seen anything like it. One conquistador noted, "We saw how the cavalry came, and we trapped them, with them on one side and we on the other, and the Indians believed that the horse and rider were one, as they had never seen horses before." Ultimately, the Spanish were victorious, and the next day, following local tradition, the defeated Tabasco kingdom sent ambassadors bearing gifts. This included turquoise, gold, jade, and even animals, but these other gifts paled in comparison to the 20 young Maya women given to the Spanish for their victory, one of whom would become a crucial part of the Spanish conquest. This young woman was known by several names, such as Marina, but in this video we're going to refer to her by one of her most common names, La Malinche. Cortés later realized the importance Malinche carried when he learned of her linguistic abilities. Not only did she speak the Mayan tongue of her hometown, but she also spoke Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. Cortés could speak Spanish to Aguilar, the Spaniard that they had picked up earlier, and Aguilar could translate this into Maya for Malinche, who could then translate it into Nahuatl. Cortés had found his key to communicating with the Aztecs, now he just had to find them. After leaving Potonchán and the Kingdom of Tabasco, Cortés sailed a little further north, landing on the east coast of Mexico in the territory of the Aztec Empire. For reference, this area of Mexico would later become Veracruz, one of Mexico's major port cities. Soon after landing, representatives from the Aztec Empire, Moctezuma II, arrived to greet Cortés and exchange gifts. The interaction went smoothly, and surprisingly, a war didn't start, but Cortés made sure to show off their firearms before sending the Aztecs back home, and we can be sure that the cannons made quite the impression. Now, before continuing, Cortés had problems to solve. Remember when he had his replacement murdered and fled Cuba in an act of mutiny against Velázquez? Well, criminal charges don't just disappear overnight, and he still needed to resolve this, or else he could face imprisonment or even the death penalty for treason. Luckily, Cortés had an idea. First, he established an official settlement, the name of which was La Villa Rica de la Veracruz. The new town council of the Villa Rica then elected Cortés as the chief judge. Now, somehow this legal loophole they had crawled through meant that they were no longer under the jurisdiction of Governor Velázquez in Cuba, and instead directly under the authority of the crown in Spain. Cortés then sent a few men to return to Spain to work out the details with the crown and ensure the legality. Now, this sounds really strange, but ironically, Governor Velázquez himself had used exactly the same strategy during his conquering of Cuba, so it wasn't exactly unheard of. With the legal mess all mopped up, Cortés continued exploring and arrived at the city of Zempoala. Zempoala was part of the Totonac kingdom, who had been conquered by the Aztecs and were now paying tribute to them. Cortés convinced them to join his side against the Aztecs, and the Totonac were quick to accept his offer. 40 of the Totonac war chiefs and a couple of hundred of their men were now numbered among the Spanish forces, and the group was ready to continue the march to the Aztec capital. But before leaving behind the coast and heading up to the heart of the Aztec Empire, rumor of a possible mutiny began circling among the Spanish. It turns out that a few of the men were still loyal to Velázquez and were planning to steal a ship and return to Cuba. The leaders of this mutiny were executed, and everyone else involved was punished harshly. And to eliminate even the slightest idea that returning to Cuba was an option, Cortés did something drastic. He destroyed his own ships. 10 of the 11 Spanish vessels in the fleet were scuttled. It's popular belief that Cortés had his ships burned, but this is actually a misconception, and the accounts of conquistadors on the expedition state that the ships were intentionally sunk instead of set on fire. With any hope of return at the bottom of the ocean, there was no choice but to follow Cortés deeper into Mexico. This was a historic gamble, but ultimately it paid off. As the group marched further inland across Mexico's diverse landscape, they encountered their next opponents, the Tlaxcalan. Tlaxcala was a federation of around 200 small, scattered cities, and its central government didn't have much influence on these towns. Despite this, Tlaxcala was unique in that it avoided being conquered by the Aztecs, but their territory was now completely surrounded by Aztec control. The Aztecs still waged war with the Tlaxcala every year in an annual event known as the Flower Wars, which makes some historians believe that the Aztec may have intentionally left them unconquered so that they could perform human sacrifice with the prisoners of war that they captured each year. After years of unending warfare and surrounded by their enemies, Tlaxcala was understandably hostile to foreigners, and they treated Cortés no differently. Returning on the 2nd of September 1519, the Tlaxcalan gathered their armies to fight Cortés as he arrived in their territory and attacked the Spanish immediately. During the fighting, Cortés repeatedly released prisoners to return to their leaders with messages of peace, and after 3 days this strategy worked, and the war leader Ixcotencatl II made peace with Cortés on the grounds that the Aztecs were their common enemy. Cortés and his men were then brought to the main Tlaxcala city, where nobles and leaders greeted them with excitement. The Tlaxcalan people were ready for revenge against the Aztecs, as on top of battling with them each year, the Aztecs had also cut off Tlaxcala from trade, and the people were lacking in many essentials. The Spanish and Tlaxcala quickly became close, trusted allies, and Cortés was extra respectful during his stay in their territory. To add to the growing bonds, 4 of their leaders were even baptized into Catholicism and added the god of Christianity to their ever-growing list of deities to worship. After resting for a few weeks with their new friends, the Spanish and the Tlaxcalans began marching towards their first Aztec city, Cholula. Cholula was one of the most important Aztec cities and one of the most beautiful. Often called the religious center of the Aztec Empire, Cholula boasted magnificent temples and worship sites, but the real attraction was the Great Pyramid, which was actually larger in volume than even the largest of the pyramids of Giza. Cortés entered the city without any bloodshed, which wasn't a surprise as the religious center didn't have a large army. Contrary to tradition, the leaders of Cholula didn't meet Cortés to welcome him to the city and had not offered him food, water, or gifts. There was an uneasy tension, and some of Cortés's allies reported that fortifications were being built outside the city. Malinche, who, as mentioned earlier, was fluent in the Aztec's language, spoke to one of the noble wives, who told her of a secret plan to murder the Spanish in their sleep. Malinche brought this information to Cortés, who, with no way to verify the validity of the story, decided to strike first and ordered his men to attack the city. The Tlaxcalan and the Spanish approached their leaders in the temple, who admitted that the Aztec emperor, Moctezuma II, had indeed ordered them to defend Cholula, but that they had ignored this order. Regardless, Cortés was highly suspicious, so he had them all killed, and then his men set fire to and attacked the people of Cholula. In just a few hours, over 3,000 people were massacred. Fearing the same fate, Emperor Moctezuma sent messengers to officially invite the Spanish and their allies to the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. As Cortés and his forces entered Tenochtitlan, they must have been amazed by what they saw. The capital was situated on an island in the center of a lake and could be accessed by long wooden causeways that crossed the water. The city was absolutely massive, and with a population anywhere from 100 to 300,000, it was the largest city in the Americas. Not only was it the largest city in the Americas, but it was also one of the largest in the world, dwarfing most cities in Europe at the time, and it was certainly an impressive sight to the Spanish. On November the 8th, 1519, Emperor Moctezuma himself came to meet Cortés on one of the causeway, gave him expensive jewelry and traditional Aztec clothing, and welcomed him to the city. According to the Spanish, Moctezuma explained that he believed Cortés to be the god Quetzalcoatl, the god of death, resurrection, knowledge, and many other things. But why would he believe such a thing? Ancient Aztec legends taught that this god, the feathered serpent god, had promised to one day return from the east to Tenochtitlan and rule the Aztec kingdom. When not in his feathered costume, the god was often depicted as a bearded man. But it gets even crazier. To add to the coincidence, Quetzalcoatl was prophesied to return in one reed year, which in the cyclical Aztec calendar occurs once every 52 years. The year the bearded Cortés arrived from the east, 1519, just happened to be one of these one reed years. The unnerving coincidence drove Moctezuma to declare his loyalty to Cortés, and he said to him, "As for your great king, I am in his debt and will give him of what I possess." Today there is debate about the authenticity of this version of events, and many modern scholars believe that the Spanish exaggerated the story in the decades after, and that Moctezuma never really thought Cortés was a god. However, it is likely that at the time, at least some of the population drew connections between the legend of Quetzalcoatl's return and Cortés. After all, there were many coincidences, but Moctezuma himself could have been quite skeptical. Regardless of Moctezuma's beliefs, it seems at first that everything in the capital was off to a great diplomatic start, and the Spanish even got a glimpse of the royal Aztec treasury, which supposedly contained so much gold that they were speechless when they saw it. But things quickly took a turn for the worse just a couple of days later. Cortés, upon seeing the great temple in the center of Tenochtitlan, asked Moctezuma to raise a giant cross and an image of the Virgin Mary at the top of it. The Aztec priests were furious at this request, so furious in fact that they killed 7 Spaniards. In retaliation, the priests were burned to death, and Cortés took Moctezuma hostage, keeping him alive to use his control over the city, as he remained emperor even while imprisoned in the palace with Cortés. During the next few months, Cortés began looting Tenochtitlan and nearby cities, melting their gold down into ingots and preparing it for return to Spain, and built a Catholic altar on top of the Great Temple. But some inhabitants of Tenochtitlan were starting to get fed up with all of this. The remaining Aztec priests and Moctezuma's brother had began rallying warriors and nobility around the idea of a rebellion to overthrow the Spanish, but were hesitant without the permission of the emperor. With tensions in the capital rising for months, Cortés received more bad news. Moctezuma informed Cortés that another fleet of Spanish had just arrived on the coast. This was a man named Narvaez, and he had been sent from Cuba by Governor Velázquez to kill Cortés for his treason. Cortés was forced to handle this immediately, so he left Conquistador Alvarado in charge of watching Moctezuma and took most of his men out of the city and off to meet the arriving Spanish. Cortés, supported by a couple of hundred Spaniards and 10,000 native warriors, ambushed Narvaez at night. Narvaez and his forces were completely taken by surprise, and after some chaotic fighting, Narvaez received a spear to the eye. After he was captured, the hundreds of new Spanish arrivals surrendered to Cortés, and after some convincing, simply joined his army. Velázquez had tried to kill Cortés, but instead had essentially sent him reinforcements and ammunition. Back in the capital, things had only gotten worse after Cortés had left. Moctezuma, while still under house arrest, had asked Alvarado for permission to celebrate the feast of Tlaxcala and was allowed to. But during the ceremony, Spanish soldiers suddenly attacked and slaughtered the Aztec nobility and anyone else celebrating inside the temple. The Spanish claimed at one point that they had intervened to stop human sacrifice, which was indeed part of the ritual, but later claimed it was a preemptive strike to quell a rebellion, while the Aztecs claimed that the Spanish had been tempted by all the gold jewelry that they'd seen on the nobles. No matter the cause, the scene was brutal, and hundreds lay dead in the temple, murdered in the religious center of their capital. To make matters worse for the Spanish, a few of the nobles had escaped the carnage and spread the word of the attack through the city, and citizens began taking to the streets, ready to fight the conquistadors and their allies. This was the problematic scene that Cortés returned to in July 1520, and just as he arrived, the city rose up in full-scale rebellion. Cortés asked Moctezuma to speak to the crowds and command them to stop, but they ignored their emperor and threw rocks at him, killing him. Despite their superior firepower, the sheer number of civilians fighting in the streets was simply overwhelming, and the Spanish had no choice but to retreat across the causeways out of the city. The retreat, known as the Sad Night, was a devastating day for the Spanish forces. Cortés tried to sneak out of Tenochtitlan, but his men were spotted while crossing the city's canals. The city was up in arms and tried to stop them from fleeing. Heavy rain poured down on the Spanish as they made their way through the angry crowds to the causeways, desperately trying to escape the city. The citizens of Tenochtitlan were armed with spears, bows, and the fearsome macuawil, an obsidian-bladed carbines. The Spanish were more outnumbered than ever before. Once on the causeways, they were surrounded on all sides by Aztec war canoes full of angry warriors that stabbed, fired arrows, and threw rocks at the fleeing Spanish. As the orderly retreat morphed into more of a panicked run, dozens of Spanish were killed or fell behind and were captured. Others, weighed down by their armor, gold and jade, fell through the gaps in the bridges and drowned in the lake. At one point, the conquistador Alvarado was faced with a gap in the causeway, and as he ran, he stabbed his spear into the bottom of the lake to carry himself to the other side. After fighting their way back back to land, it became clear just how much Cortés had lost that night. Sources vary, but it's generally agreed that at least a few hundred Spanish soldiers were killed while escaping the city, as well as over 1,000 Tlaxcalan warriors, and those that had been captured alive were already being taken up the steps of the main temple to be sacrificed. But the fighting wasn't over. Cortés was still in hostile land and was still being chased. He took his men around the city and began heading east toward his allies, the Tlaxcala, where he knew he could find refuge. But the Aztecs wouldn't let Cortés get away so easily and sent an army to kill him, which intercepted the Spanish march in the plain of Otumba on the 7th of July, 1520. The Battle of Otumba would be the first time that the Aztecs would fight against the Spanish in open combat. Up until that point, they underestimated Cortés and his abilities, especially with how poorly their retreat from the capital had gone. Even worse, the Aztecs didn't understand the strength that war horses brought to a fight, as they had only seen them gently walking around Tenochtitlan during their stay in the capital, and they weren't ready for how fast and deadly they could be in battle. The battle began with Cortés ordering his cavalry to charge straight into the Aztec front lines. This disorientated them, and with no real idea of how to counter such an attack, many of the Aztec ranks became disorganized and chaotic, but because of their immense numbers, they were still able to keep the pressure on the Spanish. Cortés knew that his chance of victory was to go straight for their leader, and quickly spotted him among his army, thanks to his ornamental headdress and colorful armor. Cortés led a charge with his captain straight at the Aztec leader and attacked him with his lance. Juan de Salamanca managed to defeat him in battle and claimed the Aztec battle standard, which Cortés then raised as his own. With their chief defeated, the Aztec army quickly fell into disarray and began retreating. Cortés was now able to march safely into Tlaxcala, rest up, and plan his return. When they arrived in Tlaxcala, as much as half of the Spanish and thousands of his allies had been killed. Nearly everyone was wounded, Cortés included, and ammunition was running low. The Aztecs sent a message to the Tlaxcala, promising them much-needed peace and trade if they killed the Spanish, which they easily had enough strength to do. But the Tlaxcala rejected the offer and reaffirmed their alliance with Cortés. As part of the new treaty with them, Cortés promised in the name of the Spanish crown that Tlaxcala would receive half the spoils from Tenochtitlan, the entire city of Cholula, and Spanish weaponry and supplies. Cortés then moved into the surrounding nations that were under Aztec control. Some he fought briefly before convincing them to join his alliance, and some joined with no resistance at all. Slowly but surely, Cortés was multiplying his strength while simultaneously weakening the Aztecs, and when some Spanish ships full of supplies and ammunition arrived in Mexico, Cortés was ready to take on the capital. With Moctezuma killed, the people of Tenochtitlan had chosen a new emperor, Cuitláhuac, Moctezuma's brother, but his time on the throne was not particularly long. The up-close and personal fighting on the causeways had allowed smallpox to pass from some of the Spanish soldiers into the Aztec population, and the disease spread like wildfire through the capital, killing thousands, including the new emperor. The Aztecs referred to smallpox as the Great Rash, and is estimated to have killed up to 40% of the city's population, and also caused intense famine in the region when able-bodied farmers were too sick to produce the food needed for such a large population. The Europeans had been battling smallpox for hundreds of years, so their immunity was much higher than the natives of the Americas, who were now experiencing it for the first time. Smallpox is one of the main reasons that the Aztecs weren't able to send massive forces after Cortés while he was gaining alliances in the surrounding area, and were instead fortifying their city for defense. Arriving at the lake surrounding Tenochtitlan, the Spanish constructed 13 brigantines or small warships. Each warship was armed with crossbowmen, musketeers, and cannons. Accompanying the Spanish forces were 20,000 allies that had joined up along the way, and together they began cutting off the capital from the outside world. They broke the aqueduct that carried water into the capital and began circling the banks of the lake. Alvarado and thousands of allied warriors began attempting to cross one of the causeways, but were repelled by Aztec warriors as the bridges were too narrow for horses to be useful. On the other side of the lake, Cortés launched his ships and battled over 1,000 Aztec canoes. These Aztec war canoes were highly effective at first, but later became outgunned by the Spanish ships in the lake, forcing a change in their plans. Day after day, the Spanish tried to push up the causeways, but had to retreat at night, losing any ground gained during the day. But the Aztecs were being weakened every day, and their food situation was growing desperate. Spanish ships intercepted supply canoes every night, and many inhabitants of the capital were resorting to drinking lake water. The Spanish were now camping on the causeways at night to avoid losing their progress, and were slowly getting closer to the city. After one intense battle, 2 Aztec chiefs were caught and interrogated, alerting the Spanish to an ambush planned for that night. War canoes were planning to ambush 2 of Cortés's ships, so Cortés launched a counter-ambush ambush and destroyed dozens of Aztec canoes. The fighting was desperate and brutal on both sides. The Spanish wrote with horror that each night they could see their own men being sacrificed on top of the main temple. We saw our comrades who had been captured in Cortés's defeat being dragged up the steps to be sacrificed. Cutting open their chests, drew out their palpitating hearts, which they offered to the idos. Then they ate their flesh with a sauce of peppers and tomatoes. After 12 days of siege, the Spanish were beginning to make significant progress. Many of the coastal towns that were supplying the capital surrendered to Cortés, and the Spanish had complete naval control of the lake. Tenochtitlan was completely out of food and water, and people were eating anything that they could get their hands on, like leather and even wood. At last, the Spanish managed to reach the city and began using rubble from the buildings to fill in gaps in the causeways, allowing their cavalry formations to march forward. Fighting in the streets was chaotic, and hundreds were killed each day as Cortés marched forward. All the while, more and more allies were joining the fight across the causeways. The exhausted Aztecs retreated to their marketplace and prepared for their last stand, which didn't last long. As the Spanish arrived in the market, they began crushing the remaining Aztec warriors, aided greatly by the Tlaxcala, who were merciless in attacking their oppressors. The Aztec Emperor Cuauhtémoc finally began peace talks with Cortés, especially after his ceremonial owl warrior had fallen off a ledge and disappeared during the fight, which was taken to be a bad omen. While these peace talks were failing, Cuauhtémoc and many of his nobles attempted to escape the city at night on a canoe, taking their gold with them, but the Spanish ships intercepted them, and the Aztecs officially surrendered on August 13th, 1521. The fall of Tenochtitlan and the first Spanish battles on the continent showed the power of modern weaponry in the Americas. Horses, cannons, and firearms were stunningly powerful, and the Aztecs had no way to counter them. During the siege, the Spanish even built a trebuchet, which was the first and last time a trebuchet was used in the war in the Americas, because the first projectile it fired went straight up into the air and went right back down onto the machine, breaking it. After the dust had settled, as many as 240,000 people had been killed in Tenochtitlan, either from combat, smallpox, or starvation. In the subsequent looting of the city, Aztec culture was destroyed without remorse, and their gold was melted into ingots to send back to Spain. Survivors of the attack fled the city in the days following the siege, and the Aztecs were banished from living in their home. With the Aztec Empire out of the way, the Spanish, with Cortés at the helm, went on to continue their conquest of Mesoamerica and founded the colony of New Spain, with its capital being built right on top of the ashes of Tenochtitlan. This capital would one day be the foundation for Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere to this day.